So what chapter in the Bible is being referred to in the title of this message? Yeah, Revelation 10. Yes, a mighty angel is holding a little book open. And John wrote that the angel told him to take the little open book and eat it up. And we saw this in Revelation 10. Verse 10 says, "And I took the little book out of the angel's hand and ate it, and it was sweet as honey in my mouth. But when I had eaten it, my stomach became bitter. And he said to me, 'You must prophesy again about many peoples, nations, tongues, and kings.'" This was a prophecy that came true, and today we will see that story. So let's go to Joel chapter 2, verse 31. It says, "The sun shall be turned into darkness and the moon into blood before the coming of the great and awesome day of the Lord." Now, the King James says the great and terrible day of the Lord, which I like better. But that great and terrible day of the Lord is the second coming of Christ, because nothing else fits. It's a great sign that is near when the sun goes dark and the moon appears like blood. In fact, such an event has been recorded on May 19, 1780. It was even recorded in the minutes of a session of the Connecticut State Legislature. And John Greenleaf Whittier actually wrote about it in one of his poems. So we have clear documentation that this dark day did happen. I would love to say more on it, but can't cover everything. So now we'll look at another verse about major signs. It says, "I looked when he opened the sixth seal, and behold, there was a great earthquake. And the sun became black as sackcloth of hair, and the moon became like blood. And the stars of heaven fell to the earth, as a fig tree drops its late figs when it's shaken by a mighty wind." So we see some other signs here besides the dark day and moon looking like blood. There would be an earthquake and falling stars. So the signs of the end, the first one that was notable was, at least in Europe, they viewed it as a sign of the end, where millions and millions of people felt that earthquake, the Lisbon earthquake. And then, that was 1755, the dark day and the moon like blood happened in America. So that didn't get the Europeans' attention the same way as it did Americans, but that was 1780. But the thing that really got them going in Europe especially was the captivity of the Pope in 1798, because they believed that was the end of the 260-day-year period of papal supremacy. And it sparked an interest and understanding Daniel 8:14 in the 2000 days and the return of Christ. So in the 1810s and the 1820s especially, there was tremendous interest in England. The Albany Park lectures were going on, and there were many different viewpoints being shared, and those viewpoints hindered all this interest into becoming a movement. But when they were trying to calculate the 2000 days, people came up with all different dates. The date that was the most common was starting the 2000 days with the year 453 BC and ending it in 1847. In fact, that's what Joseph Wolff believed when he went preaching to all these different nations in the world. If you have your timeline in your bulletin, you can see on the timeline on 1810, there's a name, John Brown. John Brown actually started the 2000-day prophecy with the date 457 BC, ending in 1843. He was the only one for quite a while that used that date. So then the falling of the stars came after most of that interest in Europe was starting to die down. But the falling of the stars came later, but only in America. It came after Miller had started preaching, of course, was a big boost to the work of William Miller. So now I want to, let's just talk about where it all began. I'm kind of proud of this because this is where I grew up. And I know this part of the country like the back of my hand. But this is where Miller started, and all the early pioneers came from this area. We'll do some close-ups on this a little later. But let's look at William Miller. William Miller was a deist. He's a very smart man. He majored in the inconsistencies of the Bible so he could not feel like he had to be a Christian. and he made fun of Christians. And his deist friends and he would get together and laugh and mock Christians. He really wasn't a mean person, but this just seemed to bring out the worst in him. And but through some events in his life that made him think maybe God really was involved, and he also read a sermon for a pastor that was absent, and that sermon touched his heart, and he decided that he was going to study the Bible seriously and try to figure out, what does it all really mean? And is God really personal? And so he really got serious in his Bible study, and he later said, the scriptures became my delight, and in Jesus I found a friend. Miller had a genuine conversion experience. His life changed. Now, Miller knew nothing of scholars and prophecy lectures in London. He didn't know anything about that. He was from rural upstate New York. And if you can see the New York part, that's the red part. And there's like a lake up there between Vermont and New York. At the bottom, near the bottom of that lake, there's a town called Lowhampton. That's where William Miller was from. That's where he had a farm. And his house still stands there today. Probably some of you have been there. So anyway, he was from Lowhampton, and the laser didn't work this morning. I figured it wouldn't work again. All right. And the verse that really was the center of just about everything he studied and the people in London was Daniel 8:14. He said unto me, for 2,300 days, then shall the sanctuary be cleansed. Now, when you look at this verse, there's two natural questions that come up that you have to figure out. One of them would be, well, when does the 2,000-day years begin and end? Well, Miller started it in 457 BC, the same as John Brown, which was rare compared to all those other scholars in Europe. And he ended it in 1843, 1844. Now, he didn't end it just in 1843. He gave 2 years because he knew that it should be by the Jewish calendar, and the Jewish calendar doesn't match up perfectly with the Roman calendar. So he calculated that Jewish calendar would start in 1843 and finish in 1844. So the first question is, when does a time period begin and end? Miller thought he had it figured out. And the other question is, well, what does it mean the sanctuary will be cleansed? The European scholars equated that with the second coming, and so did Miller. We'll get more on that in a few minutes. Now, in the early 1800s, optimism was very strong in both Europe and America. In fact, in America, that optimism got so strong that when you take U.S. history, you get a name for it. The era of good feeling. You guys are looking at me like you never heard that before. That was during the presidency of James Monroe. People just said America's in an era of good feeling, like nothing can go wrong. We're just on the rise. And that era of good feeling was in Europe too, maybe not quite as strong as in America. And during this time, many missionary societies were founded. Many Bible societies were organized, but maybe not what you were thinking. Because the goal was to convert the whole world, but it was to usher in the golden age, the millennium. Most theologians in Europe and America believed that the second coming would come after the millennium of 1,000 years. But the signs of the end that we mentioned a few minutes ago were causing people to kind of reconsider and be open to the idea that maybe the second coming comes first. Some of Miller's views were a big change from what people were used to hearing. So what did Miller believe? Well, the first thing, I shared what he wrote about finding Jesus as his friend because I want you to understand that the most important thing to William Miller wasn't the 2,000 days. The most important thing to Miller was Jesus Christ. And so he always preached Christ as the only way to salvation. And no matter what prophecies he was preaching, he always encouraged people to give their lives to Jesus. That was number one for him. And then he believed in a literal second coming before the 1,000 years, before the millennium. which was much different than the prevailing beliefs of the day. And in that literal second coming, he believed the righteous dead would be resurrected and the wicked and the earth would be destroyed by fire at the second coming. And then another thing he believed was he believed that focusing on Jerusalem and Palestine was not where the prophecy was pointing. He believed that the whole concept of Jewish restoration as a nation was not what Bible prophecy was getting at, because he believed the Bible prophecies applied to spiritual Israel. Now, in London, many of those prophetic students were caught up in studying the role of Israel, and it caused a lot of distraction and a lack of unity. But Miller was clear on this. So one thing I just want to say about this as you look at it, our Seventh-day Adventist heritage is rooted in these Millerite beliefs. We got them from him. Now let's look at Miller's difficulties. These are the things we didn't get from him. All right, first of all, in his view of the literal return of Jesus, he could see it ranging from March 1843 to March 1844. Now, since he wasn't an authority on Jewish calendars, and he didn't personally know any rabbi he could go talk to, he didn't know exactly how to start the Jewish year and end it. And he knew the Jewish year began in the spring. He knew that, but he didn't know the exact day. And it's very close to the spring equinox. So he just made his final year of Earth's history to start with March 21, 1843, and go to March 21, 1844. Not really what you call a biblical conclusion, but he didn't have anything else to go on. So the dates are not a major problem because they're pretty close, but they're not really accurate either. All right, and then the biggest one was he believed that the cleansing of the sanctuary was the cleansing of the earth by fire, that it was the executive judgment, the second coming. So let's look at Daniel 8:14 again. This language, the sanctuary shall be cleansed, Miller knew it was Day of Atonement language. It came from the ceremony of the Day of Atonement, because on the Day of Atonement, the altar was cleansed, the holy place was cleansed, and the people were cleansed. He knew that was in Leviticus 16. He knew that the cleansing of the sanctuary connected to the Day of Atonement ceremony. Miller knew this, but since there was no sanctuary on earth for a literal Day of Atonement festival, he ruled that one out, because there's no cleansing of the sanctuary possible when you don't have one. That seemed pretty logical. Now, he also knew that the Bible taught there was a heavenly sanctuary. Yeah, he knew that. But everything in heaven is perfect, so he concluded that that sanctuary wouldn't need cleansing. That was his biggest mistake. Now, he also found many Bible verses that talk about the earth as God's sanctuary, a lot of them in Psalms and the poetry. And he said, well, that is something that's in great need of cleansing. And so the second coming would cleanse the earth by fire. So he used what he considered a process of elimination, and there's only one answer left that's biblical. All right, so then we go to Revelation 14, 6 and 7. This is the first angel's message. Let's read it. And then I saw another angel flying in the midst of heaven, having the everlasting gospel, to preach to those who dwell on the earth, every nation, tribe, and tongue and people, saying with a loud voice, fear God and give glory to him, for the hour of his judgment has come, and worship him who made heaven and earth, the sea and the springs of waters. Did Miller preach the everlasting gospel? Yes, he did. He did it as good as almost anybody ever has. He preached the gospel found here in the first angel's message that's in verse 6. Did he preach the judgment? Yes, he did. He had a view of it as the executive judgment rather than an investigative judgment, as was learned later, but he did preach the warning of the judgment. And so Miller preached the first angel's message. All right, so what do we know about William Miller, his abilities and his skills? What kind of man was he? Well, he was a farmer, and some people say, just an uneducated farmer, but that would totally misunderstand who he is. William Miller was very well read. He was self-educated. He only had 14 months of formal schooling. But the truth of the matter is that was normal in his time. So sometimes we brag about Ellen White only having 3 years of formal education, and we don't realize she actually had more than most people in her day. Did you know that? Yeah. As far as formal education. But he was self-read, self-educated, he was a jack of all trades. He actually was a justice of the peace because people started realizing that he had great arbitration skills. He could settle disputes in a community. So he got elected to be justice of peace. He had good writing skills, and he was very well read in history. Very well read in history. He loved history. He took the Bible seriously when he found Ecclesiastes that God requires the past to be learned. And he understood legal matters. He had made it a point to understand the law, and he actually served time as a deputy sheriff, all while he was farming. Some of these farmers are amazing. So what do we know about what kind of person Miller was? Well, he was very respected in the community. He was successful. He was a family man that actually led his family in family worship. He became a church member, a generous one, involved. He held home prayer meetings. He enjoyed Bible discussions and studies. He was very sociable. That showed when he was a deist and he made fun of Christians, but now he's very sociable with like believers and people in the community, and he kind of went through a change of friends. By 1818, and you can see this on the timeline that was in the bulletin, by 1818, he came to all his beliefs, but he didn't preach because he wasn't a preacher. It wasn't until his call to preach in 1831, 13 years later, that he actually began to preach. And he received a steady stream of invitations. Once he got that first one, they just kept coming. And he was preaching in upstate New York, Vermont, New Hampshire mostly, not real far from home. It's interesting that several denominations gave him a license to preach. Now think about that for a minute. Does that sound kind of unusual? To have several different denominations give somebody a license to preach in their churches? Why did they do that? Well, because everywhere Miller went, he brought new converts into the church. And so the pastors wanted him because he was helping them with their church growth. And whether it would be a Baptist church, and he was a Baptist, or a Methodist church, or a Presbyterian church, or the Christian Connection Federation of Churches, or congregational churches, it didn't matter. He brought in new people. He was all about Jesus first. And that was greatly appreciated in his early ministry. Now, in 1833, when the meteorite shower came of the falling stars, when that occurred, it just assured the continued interest in the signs of the soon coming of Jesus. It was a boost. In 1836, a book of Miller's presentations was published, and that eventually would get around to people who would have more influence. Then in 1837, and I think this is on the timeline, there was a recession. Well-timed recession for Miller. Because when people face hard times, there's always at least a general increase in the interest in prophecy about end times. So Miller was plenty busy, often traveling. And now I'm going to tell you about a very interesting encounter he had with a doctor that lived kind of in his neighborhood. It was a doctor that he took his kids to if they were sick, or I should say the doctor who came to their house, because back then doctors usually came to your house. So this doctor was kind of thinking Miller was getting too crazy on this second coming stuff. And he was telling people that William Miller was developing a mental illness. And word started coming back to Miller. This doctor said that Miller was a monomaniac. You say, well, what's a monomaniac? Well, this doctor said it's an actual mental health condition where a person is rational on everything else in his life, but on one thing he becomes a raving lunatic. So Miller is becoming a monomaniac. Well, Miller heard about that, and he didn't take it personally. He was friends with the doctor, but he was calculating what to do. He came up with a plan. And one day, his daughter was sick. So he sent word to the doctor that he needed him to come to his house. So the doctor comes and he's, checking over the girl. And Miller is sitting in the corner of the room, slumping over a chair like he's just not feeling well. And the doctor kept looking over him, wondering what was wrong with William. So when he was done with the girl, he turned around and said, "William, what ails you? Are you feeling ill?" And Miller said, "I don't know what ails me. Do you think you can examine me and figure it out?" Doctor says, "Sure, I'll see what I can do." And then the doctor says, "What do you think is wrong with you?" Then Miller says, "I don't know. I might be a monomaniac." Doctor kind of blushed a little bit. He realized Miller knew what he was saying. And so he goes, "Well, how do you suppose I do that?" And Miller said, "Well, if you listen to me present my understanding of the second coming, it should be pretty easy for you to figure out if I'm a monomaniac, don't you think?" Doctor's kind of like, And he says, "I'm paying you." And he goes, "I think it'll take you 2 hours to figure it out." Doctor was not comfortable with that, but he stayed out of respect for Miller. And Miller engaged him in his presentation. He had him looking up verses, asking him questions, and the doctor's totally immersed in it. And when the 2 hours was up, the doctor was red in the face, he was angry, and he stormed out of Miller's house. The next morning, the doctor was back at his door, looking almost like he had literally gone through hell. Miller answered the door, and he says, "Mr. Miller, I've thought about everything you shared. I thought about it all night, and I do think it's true. I think Jesus is coming, and I'm not ready. I'm going to burn in the fires." He goes, "Can you help me, Mr. Miller?" So William invited him in, and he showed him the way to Jesus. And that man gave his heart to Jesus, and when he left Miller's house, he was just as much a maniac as William Miller. Josiah Litch. Josiah Litch was one of the most well-known preachers and scholars in the New England states. He read Miller's book, and he joined Miller in preaching the prophecies. Josiah Litch wrote his own book on the trumpets of Revelation, and his own book had a tremendous effect. We'll come back to that in a few minutes. And then we have Charles Fitch, a very well-known, very popular speaker, began preaching the near advent of Christ. So as we look at the leaders of the Millerite movement, we have Josiah Litch, and I'll tell you what he had in his book. In his book, studying the trumpets, the sixth trumpet is about the rule of the Turkish Empire, and there's time prophecies in there, and he took Miller's day-year principle and applied it to that time prophecy on the reign of the Turkish Empire. And he saw that time period was almost at an end. In fact, he calculated that it would end exactly on August 11, 1840. And his book only came out like 2 weeks before that date. And so everyone's saying, "There's a prophecy in that book. You got to get the book." And so people are saying, "Well, how can this come true? Because there's not too much of a war over there at the moment." There had been plenty of war, France and Turkey and England and everything. But on that date, the Turkish Empire signed a treaty and agreed to come under the protection of the British Empire, basically meaning that there no longer was a Turkish Empire. And it was a prophecy fulfilled to the day, and Ellen White in the Great Controversy says it was a fulfillment of prophecy to the day. Well, then we have Fitch, who I already showed you a picture of, very popular preacher. Fitch took the prophecies of Miller and designed a prophetic chart. And preachers began using that chart and preaching. And even people who hadn't preached before said, "I think I can talk about that chart." And they started using it. And then possibly the most important person is Joshua Himes. Joshua Himes was a marketing genius that basically launched the Millerite movement. And I'll explain a little more so you'll see how he did that in a minute. But I want to tell you that many terms Adventists use today were coined by this man way back then. I'll give you one, for example. Before Joshua Himes used the word, no one ever called anybody an Adventist. Never. People believed in the second advent, and Himes said, those people are Adventists. They believe in the second advent. Of course, all the Millerites were first-day Adventists, not Seventh-day Adventists, but they were Adventists. So he coined that term. And now I got a picture of Himes. What really made Himes, one of the things that made Himes a real help to Miller. See, Miller was a good preacher, but a lousy promoter. Up until this time, Miller was just going where he was invited, and he was only getting invited into little country churches all over northern New England. And he was getting closer to the Boston area and some smaller churches north of there. And it was at a camp meeting north of Boston that Himes heard him for the first time. But Himes invited him to come to his big church in Boston. Himes was a big city preacher. And he had him come for the first time to a big city, to a big church. And as he talked with Miller, he realized Miller doesn't know how to promote this. And so Himes took over Miller's itinerary. He started scheduling him. He scheduled him to other big churches in Boston. He scheduled him to big churches in New York City. So I put, see Lowhampton up by the lake. Down at the bottom, you got New York City and beyond. He scheduled him to some big churches in Philadelphia, Baltimore, and Washington, D.C. And of course, Boston, there on the Bay Area of Massachusetts, several times in Boston. And up north of Boston, you can see Portland, Maine. Himes scheduled him to go to Portland, Maine. Portland, Maine wasn't as big as those other cities, but it was the biggest city in Maine. And it's where Ellen Harmon and her family lived. And Ellen Harmon heard him, as a young girl, she heard him speak with her family sitting there. And she writes about it in Life Sketches. And I just want to tell you one thing she wrote about that impressed her and she never forgot. You see, the auditorium that Miller was preaching in was so crowded that you couldn't see an empty seat anywhere. And the program had already begun, and a little lady came in the door from the back. And she was standing there, and she couldn't see where to go. But Miller, being up front, could see there was one open seat in the whole auditorium. It was right on the front row. And he knew she would never be able to see it. And he actually stopped his presentation, went down and put out his arm, and he ushered her to her seat. And that really impressed Ellen, that Miller was a very kind person, patient person. Well, on one of his trips to Boston, a friend of his, I'm going to share a story I skipped in the first service. Your privilege. When he's in the Boston area, a friend of his was trying to share about the second advent with another guy that wasn't listening to him. In fact, the other guy would make fun of William Miller's teachings. Well, this other guy had a profession that you probably never heard of today. He was a phrenologist. Anyone know what a phrenologist is? I see a few hands. Well, back in those days, some people believed this was real science, but they believed that someone who was trained in phrenology could just feel your scalp and the bumps on your head and say things about your character and then be right. So William Miller's friend brought William Miller to the phrenologist, but he didn't tell him who it was. And the phrenologist, he's there, and he welcomes this distinguished-looking gentleman, and William Miller takes the chair, and then the guy starts feeling William's head, and he says, oh, this man has a very well-constructed cranium. He's obviously a man of great character, and he's going on. And it just seemed like he was the only one in the room that didn't realize it was William Miller. So everyone else that's waiting their turn is getting big smiles on their faces. And this guy, the more he goes on, he's describing this man he's examining now as a complete opposite of what he imagined William Miller to be. And he was wishing that he could have William Miller there so he could find all his defects. And every once in a while, there was a little chuckle. The man who brought him in was just sitting there kind of enjoying it. And by the time he was done, this man had built up William Miller into such a wonderful person, definitely the opposite of this preacher out there. And then when he was done, he asked William Miller his name. Miller didn't want to tell him because he didn't want to embarrass him. And he goes, no, I insist. He goes, it's of no consequence what my name is. And he says, no, I insist. And he goes, my name's Miller. They call me Miller. He goes, what's your first name? They call me William, sir. And he goes, what? The preacher of the prophecies? And then he just falls back in his chair while everyone else bursts out laughing. I don't know if that converted the phrenologist, but that's the story. William Miller told that story himself sometime later. Now, there were many other preachers. While I was telling all these William Miller stories, you're supposed to be seeing his face. There were many other preachers that started preaching the advent of Christ. Too many to mention, but I must mention two not so well-known individuals. William Foy actually had 4 visions during the Millerite movement. There's not a lot we know about him for certain, but he did write about his first 2 visions, and he did hear Ellen White share a vision once, and he told her that he had had the same vision. And so they had met, and we know he never became, he was a Millerite, but he never became a Sabbath keeper, he never became a Seventh-day Adventist, but he did pastor a church for almost 30 years after 1844. But we don't know a lot about him. We don't know why he received the gift of prophecy and then it stopped. Those are questions that I'm going to have because I'm really curious about that. There's conjecture. Delbert Baker wrote a book on William Foy, and he has possible ideas that are worth considering. But anyway, then another person who was basically unknown at the time was James White. James White was not a preacher, but he got one of Fitch's charts, and he got some instruction on how to use it. And he's just a 21-year-old nobody that just decided to get a horse and go with his chart and travel all over Maine in the middle of the winter for 4 months, preaching the prophecies and the return of Christ. So you can see where Maine is there. The whole state of Maine, of course, is not in the picture, but we don't know all where he traveled. That there's a few exciting stories. He had a mob pelting him with snowballs one time when he was preaching. That's an interesting story, but I don't have time to tell it. But in those 4 months, there were over 1,000 people that traced their first interest in Christ, the scriptures, and the prophecies to when they first heard him. So is he really a 21-year-old nobody? Not in God's plan. And of course, we're going to learn a lot more about him later. So Joshua Himes is basically taking over the Millerite movement, or it really wasn't a movement until he took it over. And Himes organized a general conference of ministers. By general conference, we mean a general meeting. Just a general meeting. They called them general conferences. And he invited ministers and influential lay members to come, and he held it in his church in Boston. And about 200 people came. Miller was supposed to be there. He was the one who actually called for the meeting, and Himes organized it because they realized they needed to get more organized. There were a lot more people preaching. They needed to try to make sure they're all on the same page. And Miller got sick and didn't make it to that meeting, which broke his heart. Several of these general meetings or general conferences happened over the next couple of years. At one of those general conferences, they actually voted to hire Josiah Litch as a full-time preacher and scholar for the Millerite movement. He was the only one that we have on record that actually took a salary to be a Millerite preacher. But he was the most well-known preacher among all the Millerites. He had a reputation as a scholar. He had credibility, and he believed it. And he had written that book using the day-year principle. And it just seemed like they should do it, and they just asked for people to support it. And Joshua Himes, at those conferences, led people to get more excited about publishing more Millerite publications. Himes started a magazine that he named the the signs of the times. He came up with that. And it was a journal. And later, when it got closer to the fulfillment of the time, he gave it a longer name called the Advent Herald and Signs of the Times. Does that make you think of anything, like the Review and Herald? So Himes was a guy who was really good at coining terms that caught attention and worked in marketing. And he called for people to do more publishing of tracts and journals and books, and a lot of people were writing them and getting them printed. So how did Miller's views receive publicity? We've already covered quite a bit of this. More preachers join, and especially Miller going to the big cities. We have the printed page, tracts and magazines, the Signs of the Times, and Himes' influence there. Both of these are Himes' thinking. And then we have these general conferences and local conferences. These were organized by Himes. The difference between a general conference and a local conference is a general conference was a calling to more for leaders to come from a wider range. The local conferences is when those leaders went back home and called smaller conferences in local areas for organization. And then the fourth way that Miller's views received publicity was camp meetings. In 1842, which was in 1842 at one of the general conferences, they decided, people were urging them to do camp meetings. You know, Methodists had done camp meetings. That was a well-known thing in American history. And so they decided to organize 3 camp meetings for the summer of 1842. 31 happened instead because people were just organizing their own. And in fact, the first one wasn't even one of the 3 they organized. But the first official one they organized probably had 10,000 people in New Hampshire. So that summer, 31 happened. The summer of 43, 40 happened. The summer of 44, there were 54 camp meetings, 125 altogether. Now, in 1842, the Millerite movement's really picking up momentum, and at the same time, mainline Protestant churches started turning against the Millerites. And antagonism toward the teaching of the second coming of Christ began to pick up. Adventist believers were starting to get expelled from their home churches. Miller, Himes, and Litch advised people to stay with their churches as best they could. They wanted they didn't want the Millerite movement to be viewed as a separate denomination or anything like that. They wanted it to be interconfessional. You know, they were kind of ecumenical in this view. But they were really wise to have handled it that way because there hadn't been serious opposition until this point. Charles Fitch saw it differently. He saw the second angel's message. Another angel followed saying, Babylon has fallen, that great city, because she made all nations drink of the wine of the wrath of her fornication. That's the second angel's message. Fitch saw 2 falls of Babylon. Babylon is fallen. Now, all the Millerites believed that Babylon was the papal church and that it was corrupt and fallen. But Fitch believed that all the Protestant churches that were now rejecting the second coming of Christ had now shown that they were Babylon and fallen as well. And Fitch was the first person to see this about the second angel's message of Revelation 14:8 and Revelation 18's call to come out of her, my people. Fitch preached a sermon in Ohio calling people out of Babylon, meaning come out of the mainline Protestant churches that are rejecting the second coming of Christ. Miller and Himes were distressed about it. They didn't agree with it at all. And as you know, Fitch started what is the Adventist view, as unpopular as it is. So new truths were being seen. First, we have Fitch calling people out of Babylon, according to the second angel of Revelation 14 and the mighty angel of Revelation 18. And then other new truths where Storrs and Fitch begin to teach the truth on what really happens when you die and that there's no eternally burning hell. Now, this is an interesting thing because James White, Joseph Bates, and some others, they were associated with the Christian Connection Federation of Churches. And in those churches, this was a common understanding, the right view of the state of the dead. In fact, there was a Christian Connection fellowship meeting place across the street from the Harmon's house in Portland. And so sometimes when they didn't have time to go to the Methodist church that's farther away, her mom would just take the kids across the street. So Ellen White actually heard this truth while she was a kid growing up. She heard two different views. I don't know if she determined what was right, but she was familiar with it. And so a lot of the people in the Millerite movement were associated with the Christian Connection, and they knew this truth. But Storrs and Fitch, George Storrs and Charles Fitch, were the first ones to believe it had end-time significance and to start preaching it in the Second Advent messages. And then another thing is Fitch began to teach in Victory Over Sin. And about 30 years ago, somebody found a manuscript of some of his presentations, and they got it published. It's called Sin Shall Not Have Dominion Over You. And Fitch was forbidden by his denomination to preach this after they heard it, and he just went on anyway. After all, they're Babylon. So anyway, one more new truth came up, the seventh-day Sabbath. And this came up I'm going to show you on the map. If you see New Hampshire, which is orange, and the lower part, about 1/3 of the way up, there's a town called Washington. There was a church in Washington, New Hampshire, and I got an artist's sketch of that church. And this church, they were all Millerites that went there, and the pastor of this church was an Advent preacher. And but a lady visited one Sunday, Rachel Oakes Preston, and she was actually a Seventh-day Baptist. She usually went to church on Sabbath, but there weren't very many Seventh-day Baptist churches around, and she was visiting her daughter. She was away from home, and she decided to go with her daughter to church because she believed in the Second Advent too. And so while she was sitting there listening to the pastor preach, he admonished all the people to keep all of God's commandments to be ready for Jesus to come. Well, she could hardly hold herself. She managed to wait until he was done, talked to him after the service. She admonished the pastor that he should keep all the commandments himself. He was a little bit surprised to hear that, and she began to explain the Sabbath. And he listened, and we just have a sketch of him, Frederick Wheeler. He listened, and he promised to study it out. And he studied all week very intensely. And he became convinced that Rachel Oakes Preston was correct. The Bible really did teach the Sabbath, and that God expected the people to be Sabbath keepers. He was so convinced that he preached about the Sabbath in his church on Sunday, and he made an appeal for his church members to join him in committing to keep the Sabbath. So that makes him the first modern-day Seventh-day Adventist. And when he made the appeal, Williams Farnsworth and his family stood up. That makes Williams Farnsworth the very first Seventh-day Adventist layman. William's brother, Cyrus, also stood up. But here's the thing. None of them saw that the Sabbath had end-time significance. None of them saw that as part of the first angel's message or the third angel's message. They just knew they should be keeping the commandments. So they didn't know what they had found on the level that would be understood later. So we have a photo of the Washington, New Hampshire church. Anyone here been to this church? I see a few hands. Since that church was only about 1.5 miles from where I grew up, when I was in college, our male chorus went to that church when they had a special, I think, October 22 service there. I can't remember for sure if that's what it was. And our male chorus sang songs in that little church, had great reverberation, loved it. So anyway, that just seeing the picture gives me memories. Some of those people we saw pictures of are buried in that cemetery. Well, they got the Sabbath in 1844, late winter. And when March 21 came, shortly after that, March 21, 1844, Miller's year was over, and Jesus hadn't come. Miller admitted in the publication that he had to have made a mistake, but he couldn't figure out what it was, and nobody else could figure out what it was. the Millerite movement started to lose a little momentum. And but preachers and publications were still going out. They were still having general and local conferences to organize. Camp meetings were still happening. Everyone was sure it would get figured out. Miller wrote to Himes expressing his uncertainty about what to do. What does God want me to do? He says, I'm no longer certain. He still believed the Lord's coming was near, even at the doors, but he wasn't sure what to say. Miller wrote a poem, very interesting poem, and in his poem, he's asking, why, God, do you linger? And he expresses his longing to go home. And he wrote, my Savior delays. Those are just some key lines from some of his poem. But Miller wrote for publication in one of the journals that people should find their hope in Habakkuk 2:3. Habakkuk 2:3 says, the vision, though it tarry, wait for it, because it will surely come. And people put a lot of promise in that verse. But because the verse says something about it tarrying, soon Millerite papers and journals were filled with references to the tarrying time. They found the tarrying time was in the parable of the 10 virgins. Remember the bridegroom delays his coming? They said, we're in the tarrying time. Later in the summer, August, at a camp meeting in Exeter, New Hampshire, Joseph Bates was the speaker. There was some stirring in the back of the tent, and a lady actually got up and said, there's a man here with new light. And Bates invited the man to come up to the pulpit. That man was Samuel Snow. Snow shares some thoughts from the parable of the 10 virgins. Let's consider. They were already kind of familiar with this. But in Matthew 25, where the parable is, verse 5 says, but while the bridegroom was delayed, they all slumbered and slept. And at midnight, a cry was heard, behold, the bridegroom is coming, go out to meet him. So in verse 6, he acknowledged that the bridegroom was delayed, and he says, we're in the tarrying time. Everybody saw that parable. That's where they were fit in the parable. But then when he went to verse 6 about the midnight cry, he said, at midnight, the cry would go out to meet the bridegroom. Snow said the midnight cry was right before them, and they were on the edge of their seats. And then he took them to Leviticus 23, where it explains about the Day of Atonement. So in these two verses about the Day of Atonement, well, let's read it. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, also the 10th of this 7th month shall be the Day of Atonement. It shall be a holy convocation for you. You shall afflict your souls and offer an offering made by fire to the Lord. What month does it say that the Day of Atonement was to occur? The 7th month, on the 10th day. And so Samuel Snow explained to the people that that would not be the 7th month according to our Roman calendar. And he explained to them that in the Jewish calendar, the 10th day of the 7th month would fall exactly on October 22, 1844. That was the Jewish Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur. That's when the sanctuary is to be cleansed, or Jesus would return. It was a little more than 2 months away. So now, he said, now is the midnight cry. Fitch went with it right away. Miller, Himes, and Litch didn't believe it was proper to announce a particular day and declare it like that. So they initially opposed it. But the people were swept up in a wave of enthusiasm that was later reported in one of the journals as sweeping over the land with the velocity of a tornado. By October, Miller and Himes were in full accord with the accepted date, and Litch definitely came around about 3 days before. The printing presses were going around the clock. Himes had named a new journal, The Midnight Cry. Hundreds of thousands of Midnight Cry journals were flooding New York City and Boston. Tracts were being distributed everywhere. People quit their jobs so they could full-time warn people and hand out the tracts and the magazines. Adventist farmers doing the same thing didn't have time to harvest their crops. Potatoes were left in the ground. Everybody was excited. Everybody wanted Jesus to come so bad. Joseph and Prudence Bates, though, had a sad moment. Their teenage son was not into it at all. You see, he was used to hearing the stories from his father. His father was a sea captain who had traveled the world, and this boy had grown up dreaming of traveling the world. And so just before October 22, Joseph and Prudence Bates, with broken hearts, watched their son sail away out to the sea to travel the world, not interested at all in being ready for Jesus to come. Well, Joshua Himes, he traveled up to Lowhampton, New York, to receive the coming of Jesus with William Miller and his family. That's who he wanted to be with. But Jesus didn't come. Oh, yeah, I was supposed to already show this. Get excited with what I'm saying. I forget to put my slides. So Hiram Edson, he was a devoted Christian and a farmer in western New York. And if you look over on the left side, Port Gibson is where he was from. And there were several people from his group that studied the Bible together, and they had met in his barn to sing and to pray and to study as they waited for Jesus to come. When it passed midnight, they were all devastated. He wrote, "Our fondest hopes and expectations were blasted. And such a spirit of weeping came over us as I never experienced before. It seemed that the loss of all earthly friends could have been of no comparison. We wept and wept until the day dawned." James White, a few days later, said that when Elder Himes visited Portland, Maine, a few days after the passing of the time, and stated that the brethren should prepare for another cold winter, my feelings were almost uncontrollable. I left the place of meeting and wept like a child. Joseph Bates said, only those who went through it could possibly understand the crushing disappointment that it was. But perhaps the story of Charles Fitch can help us grasp it a little better. Just how crushing and disappointing it was. In early October, Fitch was preaching in Cleveland, Ohio, or in that area, and he made an appeal for baptism, for people to accept Jesus while there was still time. This was October 8. He had a crowd at the shore of Lake Erie, and he was in the water for quite a long time, as many were deciding to get baptized. And he kept appealing and he kept baptizing, and they just kept coming because he's thinking, what's the 8th to the 22nd? It's not even 2 weeks. He says, we got to help these people make their decision. So he stayed in that water a long time. Now this is in the north. October is not winter, but it's not warm. He was in cold water with a cold evening breeze, and he got a very bad cold. It turned to pneumonia, and he died on October 14, only 6 days later. The obituary printed up for Fitch's funeral service said something to the effect that his widow and his children were waiting for the joyful reunion with their father in just a few days when Jesus returns and calls the righteous dead from their graves. On October 22, not only did the family not see Jesus to come, they didn't see Daddy either. While there was great despair, there were signs that God had not forsaken his people. Leonard Hastings, who was from New Hampshire, reported that a blight had ruined the potato crop throughout the region where he lived. Potatoes that had been harvested when they were supposed to be harvested had gone bad in storage. He had never even digged his potatoes up, and he knew it was too late now. They would have gotten frozen and be no good. Well, he felt impressed to dig up his potatoes, and he found them all in perfect condition. And he was able to sell from the abundance of a bumper crop, so others had potatoes, and his family could afford to get through the winter. Then I took the little book out of the angel's hand and ate it. And it was as sweet as honey in my mouth. But when I had eaten it, my stomach became bitter. And he said to me, you must prophesy again about many peoples, nations, tongues, and kings. The Bible prophecy was waiting to be discovered and understood. It was their experience. They had lived out the fulfillment of this prophecy and nobody knew it yet. And it gave them instruction for the future. And isn't that instruction for us today? Shall we be faithful to that instruction?